Hi there, I am Tanya Marwah and welcome to a brand new episode of Insuring India, a podcast by Digit Insurance. When thinking of financial planning, people prioritize short-term returns over long-term. One of the biggest reasons for this is said to be because the mind doesn't function logically when it comes to complicated choices, which is often the case with financial decisions. Which is why we have with us Dr. Ashlesha Khedekar, who has worked extensively in the area of understanding human biases with respect to long-term financial planning. Welcome, Dr. Ashlesha, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you for having me.
All right. So, Dr. Ashlesha, people choose to spend their limited funds for low short-term returns over important long-term ones like, where you especially worked on retirement planning. So how does the mind really function here, which makes these illogical choices, if I can say that?
So I don't, first of all, they're not really illogical. There is a logic, but
right.
It's not the logic that we have been taught,
right.
In the popular scene. So
right.
people are making a choice, right? Between spending their money right now or saving it and spending it later. Correct. So like you said about retirement planning.
Right.
So I have to choose, like if I am making X amount of money as my monthly income, I have to decide how to spend that money.
Right.
And what happens in the mind, the cognitive process that happens is that we are very visual. So 33% of our brain function is focused on visuals, right? So we think with images.
Right.
So what happens is when we have the image of something which is in the near future, when we start thinking about that, those images tend to come up in more detail.
Absolutely.
Right? And the images that come for something which is, like retirement, which could be 30 years, 20 years away, right? Those are very abstract and not at all in detail. So then what happens is that the images that you see in detail, they have more emotional response from you. Rather than the ones that you see far away. So when you get that emotional response, and let's say you are thinking about, I need to spend my money to buy something which is going to give me pleasure today.
Correct.
Right? Then that emotional response is very strong. So the decision weight when you're choosing between the current choice and the one in the future, the decision weight is more for the one now. And we are, that's how our mind works. So we are kind of wired for immediate gratification.
Right.
So that is why people have a tendency, we call it, there's a bias, the cognitive bias is called present bias. So we have a preference for consuming in the present because we are wired for immediate gratification. And, so this is why it's difficult to save. And in our current context, we've got so many avenues in which to spend our money. And social media is always throwing, spend on this, spend on this, spend on this. So it becomes hard. The temptation is more. And so the self-control becomes difficult and we tend not to save or we procrastinate saving.
So I do understand, there's a human mind which says, I'm emotional about the current concept of self that I see right now. And even for my family, for that matter, I would rather give them a holiday and a good experience over, probably giving them something which is going to see results 20 years down the line, and probably when it comes to insurance, not even see that happening sometimes, right? So how does one, and you do work a lot in the aspect of framing these choices, how do these financial choices be framed better? So that this emotional part of my brain can also work in a future perspective. So how do we maneuver, between these two aspects, like thinking about your future self as well as basically being able to apportion something out of my immediate gratification for the future?
So framing, basically it means that, the way in which the choice is presented to the decision maker. Right? So that happens in two ways. So one way is that myself as a decision maker, I can create the frame for myself, make my own choices, like, okay, this is what I have to choose from. I do it for myself. Right? The other one is it's externally generated by, say, the service provider.
Correct.
Right? If we talk about insurance. So what happens is if you give it to me as a service provider, it's externally generated, I will just blindly go with whatever frame you give me. That's the way my brain is wired, just to accept whatever is given to me is true.
Sure.
Okay. And, we do not like to put cognitive pressure on our minds, so we don't like to take the effort. So it's just easier to go with what you gave me. We call it choice architecture.
Sure.
Right? So that includes even the words which you use, when you're giving the choice to your client. Any visual representations like graphics or images or videos, all of that will come into your choice frame.
Sure.
Right?
All right.
That is one part of it. So the frame that I make for myself or that I see from someone else, that influences my choice very much.
So are we saying that, if the frame of reference that I'm thinking as of now is my family, like I have a son, so this context, right, is my son's well-being in the current frame of time,
right,
and is that education? And are you saying that we change that frame of reference to, say, maybe 10 years down the line, when the child will be in his teens and will be some challenges, there will be, external factors like pollution, etc., that will go up. There will be some, I hope it never happens, but maybe more pandemic that comes up. Is that the frame that you're talking about?
No, that is context. And when you're talking about your children, it's always a very emotional decision. So you should just know that you're going to be emotional about this. And the context I'm saying is okay, what are you choosing from? What are the products that you're choosing from for, say, insurance or financial products? Right? So the ones who are, say, your financial advisor may give you a list, a list of things that you can choose from. So that is the frame, the choice architecture. When you are being presented with the choices, that is the frame I'm talking about.
So, but Ashlesha, how do we still overcome the emotional gratification that I'm getting, or the emotional visualization that you were talking about, which I see more instant and more now? How do I make that visualization for my future self?
See, emotions are always there. I think it's better that we just accept that we are emotional instead of trying to tell ourselves that no, we are neutral and rational. That is one thing. And we also have, the planner versus doer, like you said about future self, right? Yes. So the planner is when you are in a neutral state, when you're not emotional about anything, that's the best time to make financial decisions. As the one who is spending the money or making the decision. So when you are in a neutral state, you can do your planning.
Sure.
And you have to assume that when your future self is the doer, who has to stick to the plan, and that person can be emotional. Right. It's you only, but you can be emotional. So how do you make the plan so that even if you are emotional, you cannot, you just make it difficult to undo the plan? Sure. So
it's almost splitting myself into two humans. One is the person who planner, the other person is the doer. So I split it out, and right now I'm planning for my future self.
Right.
All right.
So you plan rationally, and then let the doer be emotional, but your plan is assuming he is emotional or she's emotional, and so you don't give them any. It's like making it difficult. Like if you have an SIP or something like this, or an automatic debit from your savings account, you just make it difficult for them to undo that.
Correct.
So that it stays.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. So, Ashlesha, there's another concept, especially for us insurers, it really comes into play, which is called optimism bias. And and when I talk about health insurance, it even gets bigger, because I'm talking about a category which is probably not mandatory to buy, but I have to, it is necessary. I do understand, the importance of it, and especially with, the current context of how a lot of people saw a lot of hospitalization in their families, etc. People do understand that it is important, but yet, now if the pandemic has started to settle down, I again get into this optimism bias that I am healthy, nothing is going to happen to me, right? And I choose to, think, I kind of, give a blind eye to the other aspect of it. So how do you overcome this through some choiceful framing in the way we offer the different products, or say health insurance, to people?
Yeah. So where the person is coming from or where people come from, there is a phrase termed, by Dr. Daniel Kahneman. So it says, what you see is all there is. Okay.
Right.
So it's like whatever is in front of you, that is all the information that you use to make your choice or to make your financial decision. So it's like you just disregard anything which is beyond your little box of information.
Right.
All right. So that's from what you're asking me, like this is how people are thinking. The second other part is that we have a bias called overconfidence.
Right.
Okay. So what that means is that we kind of assume that there are so many factors which are under our control, which actually are not. So because you have led a healthy lifestyle and you have been healthy till today, doesn't mean that something cannot happen in the future.
Right.
But so even if you are healthy today could be the result of multiple variables, right? But you just assume it's all because of you.
Understood.
And therefore, people like, I don't need it. I'm healthy now. I'm going to continue to maintain my healthy lifestyle, so I don't need it. So they kind of ignore. So it's important that, it's brought to their attention. That there are other outcomes which are possible even if you're healthy now. So as you said, for the insurance providers, you need to, in some way, show that, okay, there are things, because we rely a lot on our memory to make decisions as well. Okay, so like you said about when there was COVID around and then some insurers came out with these special COVID policies. Then they got eaten up. I mean, the market was very eager for those policies because of the situation, and that was thanks to how easy it was to remember or recall that, okay, this is is around and there are problems with hospitalization, medicine, everything. Let me be safe and buy the policy. Right. But now that all of that is over, it's out of your the mind is shifted to other news basically. But it's important that, so then you show outcomes, right? That, okay, even though, at this age, this tends to happen, or statistics that, men of a particular age, I don't know, I'm not a medical person at all, but, at this, generally men at this age start suffering from something, that way. That kind of brings it to their attention again.
It's interesting that you spoke about numbers and statistics. Between two options, which is, when we convince someone with statistics versus, one of the biases that people have, which is a like me bias. When you think about people just like you, which of these two things do you think from a financial planning point of view, people, get affected with more? Is it listening to stories about people just like them? Or is it more about larger numbers that they see in that category?
It's a really good question. But I think the like me one probably will hold more sway over an individual.
Sure.
Because we like to belong to groups, that if that group is like me and they're behaving in a particular way or, buying a particular product, I will also do that. Whatever the other people are doing.
Correct.
Because sometimes the statistics numbers becomes abstract or, I can't relate to it.
We were talking about the COVID wave and how it actually saw a similar wave of health insurance also going up. How to make the people who basically made a decision which was financially sound, not just with the context that you were mentioning about a certain pandemic going on, but how do people stick to financial decision making? And you did mention a little bit about how there is a planner and a doer, but when the doer comes into the state of also being the planner, and especially it comes true for insurance because there is a renewal cycle as well. So how do you make doer at that time also, do things correctly as a planner for their future self?
See, I'm going back to the choice architecture, because whenever we have to renew, like the insurance is usually for a year, right? So we go back to renewing. That again, the service provider would have to use choice architecture. How do you motivate the person to or nudge the person to renew? So it's all going to be about how that choice is presented to them.
Sure. All right. So you mean to say that the choice between renewing and not renewing are not the only two choices that are there in the spectrum, because otherwise then it's just a yes and no.
Yeah, because what if someone other insurance company approaches me?
Right.
Like, so for car insurance, I don't have to stick to the same insurance company, right? But sometimes you get that no claim bonus and you get other stuff. Right? Or, okay, so I'm going a little off topic, but I have a personal connect with that insurance agent, right? He calls me and says, your thing is coming up. He reassures me. It's like he's taking my mental burden off. Like that cognitive load, he's making it light for me. Right? So he's on top of it. So I just kind of, okay, he's on top of it. Let me just give him the check.
Yes.
So I renew with him. So in a case where there is no person, and like you can send a mail or you send a notification or reminder that, okay, your policy is going to expire soon.
Right.
But you have to make the choice. So basically we are very sensitive to losses.
Right.
Okay, we are very, very loss averse in all domains of our life. So if you can represent the choice as a loss versus a gain in some way. Okay, so I give a really different kind of example, but if you have a magazine subscription and it's up for renewal, they always say you get a discount if you renew versus the MRP, right?
Correct.
So something along those lines.
Right. Understood. So that's interesting, and actually that especially for health insurance as a category, where, as you rightly mentioned, there is a cumulative bonus and there are some advantages, like, for example, you cover a certain waiting period if you have a pre-existing illness. But if you buy the policy again or basically discontinue and repurchase it, you probably would have to go through the waiting period again.
Yes.
So those are the loss. I mean, what I think loss.
So exactly. You highlight that as the loss.
Yes.
And then but you have to have the gain along with it.
Correct.
Because you don't want to scare people. They don't want to make a decision out of fear.
Yes. Interesting. So, like health insurance is one category of insurance which is not mandated, right? So you make the choice for yourself, and that is why probably the penetration is lower, because the choice is up to you. But when it comes to, car, bike and international travel insurance, basically where there is a mandatory component, like even if you're traveling for visa requirements, the insurance part is mandatory. Car and bike, obviously, because you're driving the car, that is mandated. But there also the issue that, we face is that people are often fickle about, which plan they want to continue with, which is why a lot of hopping is what we see out here. Also, the second aspect that we see here is that people are very price sensitive. So I want to go with the cheapest option. I just want to, because it's mandatory, I just want to get it done. And that is not the same behavior. Of course, prices across, I think for all humans, we are all sensitive to price, doesn't matter which category. But at the same time, here the optimization is more on price and less on the benefits that I'm getting. How does the mind function here? When there is a mandatory choice in financial planning, which needs to be optimized for better long-term benefits. How do I nudge the person to make, buy a better plan, and just because it's mandatory, not just go for the cheapest one? So how does that maneuvering happen?
Okay, so first of all, when it's mandatory and we are forced to buy, correct? So we have a tendency, like cognitively, what we do is label, all these expenses. The moment you force me to spend, I'm labeling it in a negative way as a loss.
Right.
Okay. So now you understand. Now immediately my decision context has become, okay, anyway I'm making a loss, like I'm forced to do it. It's a loss. Let me minimize that loss by choosing the cheapest option.
Right.
Okay. This is what is happening. So how are you going to nudge is basically once they're already in that loss frame, like in their mind, in that context, then it's the choice architecture. It's a very powerful thing. Okay. So you bring it in, okay, these are your, like the prices, and somehow you have to maybe graphically, visually, rather than just using words, show that there is benefit to the more expensive policies in some way.
Sure.
Right. Because I'm saying visually because it's easier to understand visual. I don't have to use my cognitive abilities. Keeping it a very simple pictorial kind of a thing will probably work better.
Sure. So you mean to say that, the deduction part of it, we do it for the customer so that they can, use it better, that this is this is something which is advantageous for me. This is the minimum possible because, this is a mandate by, but this is what is actually giving me advantage. Right.
Yes. So you have to change their focus from just the amount to, okay, at this amount, give more information, right? So that they're not only looking at the amounts.
And just, a sub-question there. You mentioned information. Dr. Ashlesha, how much information is good information? Since you've been working on retirement planning, which I think is something where the return versus the investment time period is pretty huge. So how do you, in that case, work on the choices that we're giving? How do we balance and not have a choice paradox for the person, even if framing is there?
See, information nowadays, you can't even control how much information you get.
Yes.
Right? But there is a thing, information overload is a thing. Correct. So then we become picky about what we will pay attention to and what we will not pay attention to. So that's on one side. And as far as choice overload, all the research, not just mine, but lots of research in this area, I mean, there's some optimum number of choices, especially when it comes to financial products. I think 4 or 5 at a time. Like, people just cannot deal with anything more than that. It leads to decision paralysis. Like, they just walk away from making the choice. So this is how much 3 or 4 is actually best, because then the person feels like, yes, there is a choice, but it's not too much that I get overwhelmed and I don't make the choice also.
True. I completely agree with you. I think this not just for financial planning. I think this choice paradox or overload is even if you enter a mall and you see an array full of perfumes, you will not be able to decide.
Yeah, that is why online shopping, sorry to interrupt, that online shopping is so much easier because we have filters, right?
Right.
So that helps us reduce the number of options, correct?
Options, correct. So, Dr. Ashlesha, thank you so much. I really hope that we can connect sometime more, and hopefully till that time, the people or we will be able to apply some of these conversations that we had. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. It was a pleasure.